I will talk about loneliness. However, in order to talk about loneliness, inevitably, I had to talk about choices. But first, there was a little issue of our meeting venue because I insisted I wanted to meet in a place where nobody knows us. Biko honestly had no problem about it because he said he was not a common face. He suggested we meet in the gardens of Moonflower restaurant at Palasina, but I said no. I know people who frequent the place. There's a balcony and a restaurant where there's also a bar at the rooftop of the executive residence by Best Western on the Riverside Groove. But I said no as well because someone whom I used to work with now works there, or I suspect still works there. And as a last choice, he suggested any cafe in Sultan Hamoud, that is 110 kilometers from Nairobi. He said we could Uber to the SGR, jump onto the train, sit in different compartments to shake off these people whom I thought will suddenly find us talking. And then just as we are nearing Sultan Hamoud, they started fire in the cabin and in the ensuing melee, slip out and abandon the train. Then walk the rest of the way. Then we'll find a cafe next to a butchery, sit at a corner table, huddled over our sugared teas, and I will wear a scarf and shades the whole time. Even that, I turned down. I said it was too dramatic. So Biko had no choice but to come to my apartment, which he had sworn not to disclose or describe. Well, he didn't really swear it, but he said he crossed his heart and he hoped to die. When he got to my apartment, up a flight of stairs, through a doorway with the census number inscribed above it in blue chalk, he asked if he can use the bathroom. I pointed down to a corridor, the door after the sink. My house always smells good and I had no problem because my toilet has a cover of a picture of a seaside beach and a palm tree. It is one of those bathrooms that has a small closed stream that runs across the shower area, a parade of thongs lying in it, silvers of clothes that are so small they look like colorful strips of spaghetti. The hand soap smells fantastic. There's a small silver can which you can press for a hand lotion that smells good. Biko found me pouring hot water into a mug, and he said that my house smells so good. I smiled politely. He looked at me as if I had an old smile that doesn't match my youthfulness, like I was using that smile temporarily. I offered him tea, and he suggested that he wanted green tea. I had purple tea, which turns out it wasn't even purple, and we settled down in a small dining table by a window and an open door that opens into a balcony from where we can see the cars on the road below. The sheer door curtain occasionally twirls in a slight breeze. Where do I even start? I was so bothered. I held my mug with both hands to warm them. I was so far away without even looking anywhere. I could see Biko reading the words from my mug. It was written, "This may contain wine." And I just had to tell him. I started off by telling Biko how I met Mike through a colleague of mine 11 years ago at a seminar in Mombasa. And the colleague knew Mike's sister. And we were introduced during a tea break when a participant started milling around about eating samosas and other bitings, lanyards hanging from their necks, trying to sound knowledgeable and engaged when all they were waiting for is the evening cocktail, when they all get to let go of these stuffy personas and release their true selves. Mike was manly, and Biko wondered if he had hair on the back of his hands. And I said no, and I asked him if that was his idea of a manly person. Well, Mike had that and hair on the back. It wasn't anything about that, it was his physicality. Yeah, the physicality. He isn't a handsome guy, as in you wouldn't remember him as the hot guy in the room, but he had that manly personality. He had a presence, a manly energy. Yeah, something like that. And Biko was nodding and telling me that he hates such guys. Well, Biko doesn't take it seriously, you know, walking around with a manly physicality. That is what Biko was so bothered about. And I started opening up my heart to Biko. When I met him, I was simply overwhelmed by his persona. Maybe overwhelmed is not the right word. I was taken by his manliness. He had this stare. He'd look at me and I'll feel owned by him. Like he'd say, "Come, follow me," and I'll follow him, you know. Mike called me a week after the conference. He invited me for a drink and we met at Tamasha on Saturday afternoon. He liked Tamasha because it was unpretentious and laid back. I didn't think I was a date because he was with his friends and their chicks. It was fun. I discovered some things during that meeting away from the seminar, that he was the alpha male. At the top of having the whole physicality, he had to also be an alpha male. It's how you could tell he was the leader of the group of his friends, even though he was the youngest of them. His friends were a bit older than him. He was in his late 30s then, and most of his friends were in their 40s. But you could tell how he controlled the table without even being loud. Or sijui ati pushy, At the parking lot later, he kissed me. He didn't dilly-dally. And as I told that to Biko was so concerned if he told me if I was beautiful, if he had a great time that evening, if he held my hand or stared at me before he kissed me like a character in a Tyler Perry movie. And as much as Biko doesn't like guys with physicality, he says guys with physicality don't do that. What I know is that he held the back of my neck with his big hands and he kissed me. A deep kiss. I honestly didn't see it coming. It took me by complete surprise. And what happened next was even more confusing. After kissing me, he didn't say anything. He simply opened my car door and I don't remember getting in. I don't remember anything but how hot my face was, how my neck seemed to be on fire. He said, "Let me know when you get home." And he simply walked back to his friends in the bar. Biko noticed that I was looking deep into my cup of tea. As I sighed, as if I could see the scene unfolding again in my cup, the crystal ball with purple tea that isn't purple. And it was as if I was staring at a confusing relationship with a surprising kiss at the parking lot of Tamasha. It wasn't exactly a relationship, It was more like a sexual relationship at first because we didn't hang out a lot. He would come over to my place because it was conveniently near where both of our offices were, and we would just listen to music and have sex. He had fine taste in everything: music, clothes. Everything he owned was nice. He loved hats, and his hats were the kind of hats people constantly stole. This went on for months, and Mr. Physicality showing up in hats at my place after work and over the weekends when we will often spend over, his attire started accumulating in my house. His ties, pants, shirts, socks, hats. I spent over at his house a few times. Other than a toothbrush that looked feminine, there was no indication that a woman lived there. Biko was concerned about the feminine toothbrush, and as I stood up to go serve ourselves more tea, he gave me that look, feminine toothbrush. And as I sat down after serving us some more tea, I explained to Biko that Mike was one of those guys who didn't want to question too much. It's how self-assured he was. Like he was above questioning. I guess he wasn't used to being questioned or challenged, so he always made you hold yourself back. Sometimes he'll be off range a whole weekend. Often, his messages will go unanswered for long. He had a bad relationship with his phone. He acted like it was a bother, so often he'd leave it in the car or forget it at home. So it wasn't uncommon for him to be gone for days without a word. He was a strange guy. And we traveled a bit. He liked safaris, the kind of guy who owned a safari hut. One time we had gone to the Masai Mara when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't know, so I ignored it. And then we went for a candlelit dinner at the balcony of the restaurant overlooking the vast darkness of the Mara. The sounds of the nocturnal wild coming to us through the still, sweet, but ominous darkness. The sky was lit by a galaxy of stars that seemed so close. I could see them in his eyes. It was perfect until my phone started vibrating. I kept ignoring it, but he looked at it and said, "Pick it." So I picked it. It was a lady. And the lady said, "Hi, Rose." And I was like, who is this? And she said, "She's Martha. May I please speak to Mike?" She was so decent and kind sounding, I didn't even think twice about handing him the phone in spite of how strange the whole thing was. And he took it with a puzzled look. Suddenly, he looked like all the air was knocked out of him. He pushed back his chair and walked away. I sat there staring at my glass of wine and waited for what seemed like an eternity. When he sat back down, we didn't even speak for a moment, as if we both wanted to enjoy the few seconds of the special moment before words completely ruined it. And I had to ask, who was that? Knowing the answer before he said. And Mike said that that was the mother of his child. This was like 6 months into the relationship. I had never heard of a baby. And as I looked at Biko as I was telling him that, I had to take some sips of tea. And I asked him, how old is the baby? And he said 1 year old. Are you with the mother? He said, sort of. What does sort of mean? You are with her some days of the week, and others you aren't. I sighed, and I slumped back in my chair like a deflated balloon. Mike tried to reach out for my hand, but I retracted them and kept them under the table. I stared out in the darkness. Out there, where a pride of lions was starting a hunt, headed by a lioness, because lions are too busy grooming their manes to be bothered with getting blood on their paws. I wondered how such a perfect moment can turn so sour in 2 shakes of a duck's tail. What a waste of stars. I sipped my wine and barely heard him say things before cutting him short. I told him I was going to bed. I stood up, dropped my napkin on top of the untouched dessert, spoiling the pastry chef's art. A Maasai guard with a big room walked me to my tented room. I had packed flimsy things for this romantic trip in the bush. Things you could see through, things you could eat through, things that elicited desire, things for the bush that brought out the bushmen in people. Instead, I wore to bed things you could bungee jump in. That night we had a major row. If I could leave the camp that night, I would have walked in that wilderness and gotten eaten by the wild animals. Biko just sat there. He asked me where his family was all these days I visited. Well, Mike told me that they only moved in not long ago because his child was asthmatic and he needed to be there. But he insisted that they were not married. It was a temporary arrangement. We came back to Nairobi and I told him to sod off. Take your hats and wear them in the sunset. But he came back the next day with apologies. And the next, and the next. He kept insisting that there was nothing between him and her, that he was being a responsible person, a caring father. I told him a responsible man will be with his sick baby at home, not dining another woman in the Mara, having his wife look for him through another woman. But I was already in love with him, and he was a good guy. Plus our sex life was through the roof, so I eventually took him back. Biko inquired how the baby mama found my number, if I ever spoke to her again. But I had to stop him. I'll come to that. It's a long story. But I just didn't take him back like that. I sat him down and I told him that I planned to get married. I was categorical. That was one of the things I was clear about before we got back together. I am not the type who sits on the side. I am not the other woman. I want a wedding and a husband who I'm not sharing with someone else. I grew up in a stable home. Mother, father, children, Bible, family car, Sundays spent together, family portraits, and holidays spent together praying and eating. Order. No drama with parents. Well adjusted. There was never a doubt that I wanted what my parents had. He agreed to marry me with time. And so we started dating again until 8 months later, when I saw on Facebook that he had gotten married the weekend he said he will be away at work. I was in a salon when a friend called me, and she said she saw someone who is a friend of a friend's page and had posted a picture of someone who looked like Mike getting married. I told her it was impossible. Mike was in Dubai. His phone had rung like he was abroad. And my friend insisted that the gentleman was Mike. She sent me a picture and sure, there was Mike in a suit dancing with a woman in a wedding dress. I couldn't breathe. I felt like my bowels would open right there. I didn't even finish doing my hair. I simply stood up and left. With half unfinished hair, I went to my car and tried to take in as much air as I could, but I was suffocating. With trembling hands, I called his phone. It rang like he was in Dubai, but nobody picked it. I called again and again. Finally, someone picked. It was his best friend, who happened to be the best man. And he said that Mike wasn't near his phone, but he will have him call me. I demanded to know where Mike was. And he said, "Listen, Rose, you will find out sooner or later, and I wish he was the one to tell you this, but Mike just got married." I don't know what I was thinking even asking where Mike was. I had seen him getting married, yet I was hoping it was all a lie, but it wasn't. I was crushed. I sat in my car and cried for hours. I couldn't even drive, so I called my friend who came and drove me home. For 2 weeks, I was sick. I couldn't leave my bed. I stayed in crying. I couldn't care if I was fired from my job. I didn't care if I decayed in bed. I woke up crying and went to sleep crying, only getting up to drink water. My best friend will pass by every evening to try and force me to eat, but I will just throw it all up. I felt betrayed. I felt worthless. I felt cheated. After 2 weeks, I crawled out of bed and wore black clothes to the office. My best friend had gone to work and told them that I was depressed. So at work, people were treating me like kid gloves. Like I was crazy. I waited for Mike to call me. I waited for him to come back from his honeymoon and explain whatever that was about. I needed closure, answers. He never called. He never called. No. 2 months went by. No call from him. It was strange. It was like he never knew me. In fact, the only evidence that I used to know him were his clothes in my wardrobe, which I trashed after 1 month of mourning. Mike never called. He simply vanished. Months rolled by. I got into a period that I call my whoring days. I was drinking a lot and sleeping with men. One-night stands were my specialty. I was bitter, but you can't imagine how easy it is to pick men from bars if you are even half beautiful. I never had a problem getting a man. I sat alone at the counter and flirted with an unaccompanied man I found attractive. A man will ask me what I was drinking, but I will tell him no. "What are you drinking?" which I'd buy him. Then he'd move closer and we will drink, and if I liked him, I'd go home with him. This went on for a long time, maybe a year or so, I don't know, maybe more. One day I was going back home from the bar, driving my small German vehicle, when I slept on the wheel. When I woke up, I was in Nairobi hospital. I had tubes in me. The man I had carried broke both his legs. He's still in a wheelchair up to date. These are the people newspapers refer to as unidentified male or female. I didn't know I was unconscious for 5 days in the ICU. My brain had swelled. My parents were in the room when I woke up. The room smelled of methylated spirit. Everything seemed bright. My head, swathed in bandages, felt like someone had used it as the white ball in a pool game. I couldn't hear what everybody was saying. I was awake for what seemed like a minute before I went under again. When I woke up again briefly, I was alone in a different room, this one with a TV. Then I went under again. Up again to my mother oiling my lips with Vaseline. Then under. When I came up again, there were relatives and a forest of get well cards. Flowers, I was told later, were irritating me. I couldn't recall a thing. One moment I was driving and the next I was here. I was told the car was written off. The second day of my complete consciousness, I spent some time dealing with visitors. Then when they finally left, I had dinner and settled into sleep. Suddenly, there was a soft knock. I thought it was one of the visitors again, only to turn and see Mike standing at the door. I was shocked. Like seeing a ghost. I hadn't seen him in something like close to 1 year. He came and sat on my bed. And he said, "Don't scare us like that again." That's just something a man with physicality will say. I wanted to tell him, "Scare you? And who? Your wife?" But I was tired and weak. I just stared at him I think I might have asked him how his wife was. I don't remember, but I remember him coming daily to visit me after that. Mostly after visiting hours and bringing me half bars of white chocolate or silly things like half-sucked lollipop or half-eaten cake that he had saved for me from lunch because he knew I loved cake. He brought everything in halves. He said it's because I was his most important half. Is this because of the bump to my head or the near miss of death? But I grew so fond of him again in the hospital. He visited daily, and I looked forward to those visitations. He seemed different. He had added weight. His shoulders rounded off in his shirts, had a bigger neck. After I got out of the hospital, he continued passing by my house to see me, bringing me groceries, skiving work to go make me meals. And Biko was interested if I asked him about Dubai. Because Dubai was now the code word of the wedding. Yeah. Oh yeah. I definitely talked about it. He owned up. But you have to realize that I was recovering at that time and I was very vulnerable. Plus, him being there meant so much. I can't explain it. And as I'm telling Biko all this, the doorbell rings and I go to answer it. There's a man with a brown envelope. He hands me and I say, Asante. And I just placed it on the stool near the door and I continued talking to Biko about how we started seeing each other again with Mike. I couldn't explain to Biko why, but this was something totally against how I was raised and what I wanted. Remember me saying I was never going to be the other woman? Life. I tell you, because there I was. Biko asked if that marked the end of my whoring days. Pretty much. A near fatal road accident changes you. It marked the end of my drinking and picking up men. Except that there was this one guy I liked during those days who stayed around on and off. His name was Mika. And Biko was concerned because he wanted to know Mika from the Bible and what big thing he did to me. Well, yeah, Mika from the Bible, but I don't know what he did to me. He's like Habakkuk. Nobody really knows what Habakkuk guy did. Mika was one of the men I'll bring home frequently because he was just a freak. I told him that I was seeing Mika and Mike. Mika was random. He was a bit dysfunctional, drinking a lot, borrowing money from me, that kind of thing. But he made me laugh. He was good with people. Mike, on the other hand, was sort of constant, but the lines were not defined. And I knew that he was never going to leave his wife. We were sort of in an open relationship. Sort of. One day the wife tracked me to my salon. I don't know how that woman will track me. She told me that they were expecting another child. It was a very weird encounter, but she was so sweet and I felt bad for her and for this whole situation. 4 months after the visit and almost another year after leaving the hospital, I went back for my routine checkup and pap smear results from my gyna. It was Friday. I remember it was Friday afternoon. I had taken time off work. And the doctor stared at my results without saying anything, and immediately I knew that they contained bad news. He started counseling me. He started off with, "Your results don't mean the end of life." I didn't want for him to finish. I grabbed my results from him and right there, HIV positive. I remember his lips moving and me slipping from my chair. I recall the ground coming to me and darkness. When I woke up, I was on the observation table with the clinic nurse standing over me. My feet were propped over a pillow. When you are diagnosed, you sort of walk in a daze for weeks, sleepless nights. You look at your veins and imagine that your blood is dirty. You are sure your life is over. I was having nightmares where I was dying and watching myself die. My parents crying around me, my friends touching my coffin, a cheap and shiny wooden thing. I dreamt of my own funeral many times. I started losing weight because I wasn't able to eat and feed this virus in me. Plus, I was always worrying. And Biko asked me if I told Mike. That's the story. I suspected where I had gotten it from. It could have been Mike, but mostly likely Mika, because we stopped using condoms at some point. But it could have been maybe one of the other guy I slept without a condom during my whoring days. And he had lied to me that he had used a condom. And since I was drunk, I didn't bother to confirm. I only discovered in the morning when I searched for rubber, and I didn't get. So as I speak to Biko, Biko is asking me if it might be Mike. Yeah, I couldn't have told him, but I opted not to do it at that time. Whatever stopped me, I don't know. I didn't know how he will take it. I didn't want him to leave me. That will mean me being alone. I wanted a child, remember? Now that marriage was out of the table. Who would marry an HIV positive woman in her 30s? I can't think of anyone, to be honest. It's hard enough for a 30-year-old woman without HIV to meet anyone even today. So that's why I kept my status to myself. And when Mike came to see me in his hat and proper shoes, we had sex that day and the end of that week. And we continued having sex. And I lied there, knowing what I knew. And I continued going for counseling and tests to see if I could start on ARVs. My health improved. Every cough would scare me. Every rash, every headache was a sign of death. I started keeping away from people, being alone in my house, avoiding friends and family. I became very withdrawn and lonely. I was so sad I wouldn't have the marriage father and mother had, that I would probably die alone. As time went by, I started reading about having a baby and if my baby would be positive, and during that time, such information was scanty. I wanted a baby to occupy me, give me purpose. I met a doctor who said that I could get a baby. So I removed my diaphragm without telling Mike, and sure enough, 6 months later I got pregnant. Mike wasn't ready for a baby with me, but since he had put me through so much, he sort of relented. He was guilty from the wedding, and so I could get my way with many things. Biko asked something that shocked me, that if Mike was not the one who infected me, was there a chance I intentionally infected him as punishment? This got me by surprise. For a moment, I thought I was going to change my mind about the interview. But I had to answer him. I looked away. I went quiet for a while. My legs started banging against each other. I had to sort of stretch, so I took the cups to the sink. I washed them, dried them. Biko must have thought I had OCD. I thought so, looking at how he was looking at me, but my house was spotless. And he asked again, and I asked Biko if he thought that was the case. He wasn't sure, he was just wondering. I was quiet for a while before I spoke, and yes, maybe, I don't know. Because Mike has a family, a wife he goes home to. What do I have? A moment? 3 hours with him? He sneaks around having his cake and eating it. What do I have? Biko popped a question again. If I loved him. But of course, yes. And Biko asked then, why wouldn't I tell him? I told Biko it wasn't that simple. It wasn't that simple. I got a baby, HIV negative baby. Maybe the baby was a bouncing baby, as they say. Maybe this one didn't bounce. The baby is now old enough and was taken by one of our relatives to the mall before I came. Mike is still in the picture. Mika is a fading story. And Biko was surprised. He looked at me and I didn't look HIV positive, which is a stupid thing to say, but still. I thought my baby would fill me with happiness, and they do. But there is another type of unhappiness that a baby can't feel. It's of knowing that I will never marry, which is something I really wanted to do. To have a wedding, a white one. To say I do to someone who is mine, not someone who lives. I feel that I wasted all my best life on Mike and I have nothing to show for it. Nothing. Just my baby. Yes, but what else? I'm HIV positive, headed to my 40s. I'm technically single with no shot at love or lasting companionship. I think about growing old alone and it fills me with dread. But I also think about dying before my baby is old enough, dying thin and wasted and thinking and leaving my baby behind. That's even worse. Biko inquires if keeping a secret from Mike is burdening. Yes. Oh yes, it is. Sometimes I hear of his plans for the future, things he wants to do. He's very ambitious. And I think to myself, you have HIV. I hope you live right to see those plans happen. And Biko asks how that makes me feel. If it makes me feel like it's a small win. Win? No. I just feel like he has to be responsible for where we are. Here. And Biko asks how. I cross my arms across my chest and I think. I tell him that sometimes I want him to share the kind of worries I have. I think he sleeps soundly next to his wife, yet he doesn't know the full story of his own life. Maybe he does. And Biko asks what we are doing, the interview. What if he finds out? What if he reads? If he will know if it's me? And if he knows, he knows. It's not an idea or a way I want him to find out. But if he knows through the blog, then he knows. We don't choose how we receive bad news. And I smile back at Biko and he looks at me. And I'm thinking, okay, he's looking at my old smile. The interview is almost over. I smile and I look at Biko as I stand up. We leave and I go downstairs at the parking lot where my car is, under an old tree. I assume he thinks my smile looks like that old tree. And he asks one last question. And as I stand in the sun, blocking the light with my forearm, he asks me who the father of my child is. Only a mother knows the true father of her child. So we say our goodbyes as he reverses, but I could see him watch my long shadow follow me as I walked deliberately to the staircase of my house, a house full of contradictions, a house full of love, born from heart, of a heart that beats with loneliness. As he drives away, and I know what he's thinking about as he walks out of the gate. Habakkuk.